Hi guys, Howard Croston back again. I've been asked quite a few questions about how I rig up to traditional upstream nymph in the river. Some of you might remember I did an article in Fly Fishing and Fly Tying a few years ago, and I got a lot of questions just after that as well, so I thought I'd do a quick video on it. Now, the first thing I will say is, like I mentioned in the Spanish leader video, good nymph fishing in a river really always comes down to three things: quality of drift, contact to the fly, and take detection. And it's no different with any kind of nymph fishing. Now, over the last few years, obviously all of the European nymphing styles have become the go-to method for a lot of anglers. And that covers all of the variations: Spanish, French, Czech, Polish, anything where you have a very, very tight connection to the nymph. Now, all of these styles of nymph fishing generally rely on one thing, which is a relatively short drift window. So basically what that means is it's a relatively short range technique to a large degree. Now, as deadly as those methods are, and they really are unbeatable in the right kind of water, it is not the be all and end all when it comes to nymph fishing. Just because we've got these new methods doesn't mean that the methods that we had prior to that suddenly don't work anymore. And in many cases, in certain water types, traditional upstream nymphing is absolutely the way to go to catch the most number of fish. I'll very quickly give you a short story, but it's a good number of years ago now. It's probably 10, 12, maybe even 14 years ago. I was fishing in an England qualifier down on the River Test. And I was down there for a practice. The particular piece of water is very, very heavily pressured. Gets a lot of fishermen, and it's predominantly fishing for grayling. It's very clear water, and it's quite even in pace, and it's quite a shallow section of water with an odd deep hole. I was down there to practice. I bumped into another guy who was practicing. I'd never met him before, but we got talking. And while we were talking, he very, very quickly looked up and down at my gear, saw that I didn't have a French leader on, which was all the rage at that time, and instantly decided that I did not know how to nymph fish in a river. So I had to stand there for a 15-minute lecture about why the French leader was superior, why it was going to win the competition. Anybody who won that competition was going to be fishing with the French leader. And basically his parting shot was, you really need to get yourself a French leader and start practicing with it, otherwise you're never going to do any good in these competitions. A long story short, I actually won that competition with a 48 fish margin, which I think was more fish than every other angler combined. And I caught every single one of them on an upstream nymph. I never picked up my French leader rod all day because I didn't need to. And that's down to the water type that I was fishing in being more suitable for upstream nymphing than it was for European style nymphing. So, what are some of the advantages, pros and cons between the two? I mentioned drift window. Now, if you think about it, when you're European style nymphing or tight line nymphing, whatever you want to call it, you typically make a cast of round about maximum 2 rod lengths. You can throw it further, but typically it's about 2 rod lengths. You raise the rod, you track the fly back downstream, you manipulate it in the drift if you want to, and then you take it out. So what happens is your fly goes in, it sinks to depth, you get a degree of fairly parallel drift as it moves along at fishing depth to a degree, where you might want to control it or carry it or do whatever you're doing, and then you induce it out. But it's a relatively short window. So there's a few issues with that in very, very smooth, very, very slick water, especially when the fish are pressured. One of them is, when your fly goes in, it creates a disturbance, you get an impact. Now sometimes that attracts the fish. In this particular scenario, in this particular river, the impact would spook the fish every single time. So when you got the fly impact, if it was anywhere near your target fish, it just shot off up the river. The other issue with it tends to be is that you need a significant amount of weight in order to get the fly down to fishable depth in a short drift window, which is particularly relevant for grayling because they're normally sitting near the bottom of the river, generally speaking. So we've got a relatively short range method where we may have to overweight the fly to get it fishing. Great in pocket water, not particularly good in relatively smooth, clear, steadily paced water where the fish are spooky. So you've got a short drift window thing going on that makes it a little bit less effective. With a traditional upstream nymph, what I can do is I can throw anything up to 4 or even sometimes 5 rod lengths of line upstream. That means that my fly impact is quite a long way away from the target area where I'm going to fish. I can then sacrifice maybe a rod length of drift while my fly gets down to fishing depth, which means I don't have to overweight the fly. I can use particularly lightweight flies, smaller beads or just with lead in them. That allows me then to get a fishable fly, something that's maybe not going to spook the fish, that's going to carry very, very well in the subsurface currents. And that's particularly relevant on places like chalk streams, and the spring creeks in North America is another very good one, where the fly is typically riding over a lot of subsurface weed. So if you have an overly heavy fly, like you might use on a Euro nymphing leader, you're going to ground out a lot of the time unless you control that fly in the drift. By throwing a smaller, lighter fly a greater distance, I get much better carry in the water column. So I get a much more workable long-range drift out of the fly. The other thing that you can do with it as well, which is really, really useful, is when you cast that traditional upstream nymphing rig a long way up the river, as it's drifting down the current towards me and I'm retrieving line to keep in good contact, which you need to when you're nymph fishing, I can also, with a little bit of practice, start to manipulate that fly in the drift. So I can actually strip sometimes a little bit faster than the water flow to make that fly lift in the water column and then drop back, which is an induced take. So when I get quite good at manipulating that line and working it in relation to the speed of the river, I can induce the fish a lot of times in the course of one drift, and it can be absolutely deadly. Another good little trick with it is we can actually cast the flies out and then introduce a mend at some point on purpose, which again will cause the flies to lift and curve in an arc in the water column. And sometimes that in itself can be absolutely deadly. When the fish have seen everything else, and even a standard induced take where you're lifting the fly quite straight up through the water column doesn't work, that angled whip of the flies, even though it's quite an unnatural movement, can really trigger the fish to eat that nymph and can be absolutely deadly. So how do you rig up for it? Well, my rig for fishing that type of method, I would typically use a fairly standard rod of anything from 9 to 10 feet in length, 3 or 4 weight floating fly line with a relatively delicate taper. And then all I do is straight out the end of that fly line, I needle knot 2 short, heavy sections of monofilament. This is 0.37. One section is like a fluorescent pink and white, and the other one is fluorescent yellow. They're 30 centimetres long so that it's legal for FIPS, and then in the end of that I have a small micro ring or a micro loop where I attach the tippet. The tippet section is completely level. I do not want any taper in it whatsoever, and I fish it as thin as is sensibly possible for the fish and the water that I'm fishing. And the reason is, I want that tippet section to cut down through that water and sink as quickly as possible. The other reason is, I want contact to that nymph. The thinner the connection is between me and that nymph, the better the contact, the better the drift, the more fish I'm going to catch. So I use level straight off the end of the ring to either 1 or 2 flies. Now, total leader length of the whole thing, I will never really go much above 12 foot at the absolute maximum. And typically I will keep it as short as workably possible because I want bite detection. So how do I see the takes? You'll see that this coloured monofilament that I have is not dead straight, it's actually slightly kinked, and that's done on purpose. What I do then is I heavily grease that, so this is covered in mucilin when I'm fishing, and this actually sits up on the water with a bit of a kink in it. So if anything touches that fly, I can see it move and I can set the hook. It's an absolutely deadly way of fishing nymphs in a different manner to what you would with a tight line or a European nymphing style. So the next time you get to the river and you look at the water in front of you, just think about it. If you've got pocket water, broken riffles, lots of structure where you need a relatively short drift window, by all means pick your Euro nymphing rig up. If you've got smoother, more placid water that's clearer, where you need a much longer drift to maybe get a little bit further away from fish you don't want to spook, or you just want to fish a lighter fly a little bit more naturally to get more takes, pick up an upstream nymphing rod. Now I know some of you will probably think, well, I can do that with the duo. You can, and it works, but bear in mind with the duo, you've got a set depth that you're fishing to. With this, I can vary that depth quite a lot by a number of things. I can tuck the flies when I cast to make them dive deeper. I can throw further, again, to get them to sink over a greater area, or I can come short, cast a little bit shorter, and get a shorter drift through shallow water. So I've got a little bit more variability and versatility. Just to wrap it up, give it a go. It works phenomenally well. Chalk streams in the south of England, spring creeks in North America, and some of our bigger freestone rivers which have got smoother flows in areas outside of the fast pocket water. It can be absolutely deadly. You really need to give it a go. Anyway, I hope that's been of help for you, and I'll speak to you all again. Thanks a lot.